has a direct bearing on changing technologies. And my sense has been for some years that the appreciation of that has not been widely understood as to exactly what it is about data networks that differs so substantially from telephone networks as to make what was seen to be okay, not okay. So when the IETF decided to look at this area in their Vancouver meeting in the last year, they came out with a statement which was quite broad and quite strong about how to deal with this and what it meant technically. I won't go into details because Jari is here and he will give you the ayes and nays on that. And I felt, well, that as they're meeting in London this week, it would give a good opportunity for Parliament, particularly in the oversight areas of what it's looking to do or might look to do, to understand some of the fundamentals of how data networking people actually see these issues. So that's kind of the background. But also, there are a lot of other people here who have other perspectives. So it would be very interesting to hear what's happening. I also like to thank Julian Huppert, particularly, and the staff, Susanna and Venus, who have been amazing putting up with us to organise this event, having to shift us from one room to another and sort of still keeping tabs. So please pass on my thanks to them. Also to our panellists and to Matt Long, who will be taking this on from the Daily Telegraph Media Group head of to lead the debate. So thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christian. I could ordinarily, in this situation, go around and introduce each of our panellists and tell you what I think of them, but that's not really the best way to start. So what we're going to do is each of our panellists will introduce themselves very briefly. We will then hear from our three distinguished parliamentarians on the panel and then move round. Each speaker will get up to 10 minutes. I would encourage, given the relatively limited amount of time, we're going to wind up sort of 6:30, 6:45. I would not encourage any speaker to feel they have to fill those 10 minutes. But if we can start off with just a very brief introduction from Jari and working around through why you. Thank you. What your interest is in the area and what you'll be speaking about later.
Right. My name is Jari Arkko. I'm the chair of the IETF, or Internet Engineering Task Force, and I'm here in town with my 1,400 my closest friends, the IETF networking engineers, and we're very eager to understand how we deal with all kinds of challenges facing networking today, including surveillance issues.
Lovely. Jari, Wendy.
I'm Kathy Brown. I am the president and CEO of the Internet Society. The Internet Society is, in fact, the home of the IETF. The IETF, of course, is a technical standards body. We have other functions inside the Internet Society where we study, analyze, and talk about and try to affect policy having to do with the Internet. So, thank you.
I'm David Davis. I'm a backbench member of Parliament in the House of Commons with a longish interest in this particular area of surveillance.
Julian Huppert, Liberal Democrat, Member of Parliament for Cambridge. Before I came here, I was an academic and wrote various Perl scripts, so I read very few of them.
Very wisely. I'm George Howarth. I'm a Labour MP and I have been a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee since 2005.
I'm Ian Brown. I'm Associate Director of Oxford University's Cybersecurity Centre, and I was asked to talk a little bit tonight about whether privacy and security are always trade-offs or whether you can find overlapping and complementary aspects to them.
My name is Nick Pickles. I'm the Director of Big Brother Watch, and at the very non-technical end of the citizens' interaction with things involving privacy and broadly civil liberties.
Thank you very much. We are lucky to have representatives from all three political parties, so if we can kick off with George, please.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for holding this discussion today. I think it is timely, and I think it raises important questions that all of us as citizens or politicians, whatever party we belong to, whatever ideology we support, have to address. I wanted to start by making a couple of points and then move on to a number of questions I think that we need to answer. The first thing I want to say is that as both in different ways Yvette Cooper said yesterday in her speech to Demos, and Nick Clegg today in his Guardian article, less directly but nevertheless importantly, said that we need to have a national debate about where we go with all of these issues, because they do pose questions that we've never had to confront before. And I know from the time I've spent on the Intelligence and Security Committee that there are issues that all of us from time to time struggle with. So I think it is right that we, as Yvette said yesterday, that we have a national debate about where lines are set, what issues can be addressed, what institutional changes may be necessary in order to make sure that we do a proper job of controlling these, first of all, the powers that the state have available to them, and on the other hand, the capacity that people have to use social media sites and the internet in general to do harm. They are huge questions, and I don't at this stage intend to come up with a catalogue of things I think we can do. A, because I haven't got a catalogue of things I think we can do, but B, because I think it's too early in the debate to be drawing any firm conclusions at this point in time. The second general point I wanted to make by way of introduction is that there are some confusions, largely in the light of the Snowden revelations, that do need to be cleared up. And they may seem like nitpicking points, but I think they are important. The first is that there is a confusion, or maybe a deliberate elision, between what the various agencies in the UK and the NSA in the United States have in terms of capacity, and how they and in what circumstances they access that capacity. I think we have to draw a distinction between the two. There are still problems. The normal distinction that people do make is between data and communications, but there are other distinctions that have to be drawn as well. And I think we need to be more precise as we move forward in the terms that we use and how we address what the capacity is, and in what circumstances those agencies of the state can gain access to what constitutes that capacity. And probably it goes without saying that just because they have the capacity to do something, it doesn't necessarily mean they have the authority to access it. That might seem like a fine distinction, but I think it's an important one. So they're just a couple of words of introduction. So let me just move on to a number of questions I think that we have to grapple with if we're going to have this big national debate. The first one is, do we believe that the internet, and particularly social media sites, should constitute a safe haven for people who are, for example, plotting terrorist acts, or involved in paedophilia, or involved in criminal activities of one kind or other, including organised crime? And it may sound, the way I've posed it, as though it's a no-brainer, but actually you can have, there is an argument that particularly younger people put to me, that actually it's, if those sites are used for that purpose, it's nobody else's business. And there is no responsibility on those involved to report activities that might be going on within those social media sites that could lead to terrorist attacks, could lead to organised crime, carrying out large-scale operations that, against our bank accounts or against our personal data. And it's nobody else's business if somebody decides to engage in paedophile activity, sexually exploiting young people. That is nothing to do with anybody else. And they're big questions that we have to grapple with. And I'm not going to provide an answer here. It may sound like, in the way that I've formulated the question, that I already do have an angle on it. And on some of those subset of questions I do. But nevertheless, the things that we can't ignore and we need to take into account as we take the debate forward. And the second, and it follows on from the first question, is where do you strike the balance? Where does the balance between my liberty to conduct communications online by whatever means I choose, with whoever I choose, and the state's ability, or the ethical considerations that go with the state's ability to interfere with that in one way or another? That is an enormous question. And at this stage in time, I don't think there's a settled view in this country as to where that line should be drawn. There are polar extremes of the argument, some of which I've already referred to, but we haven't really settled where that line should be drawn. I'm always guided, which might please Julian, I don't know, on these sorts of issues by John Stuart Mill and his essay on liberty, which I suspect a lot of people have either heard of or possibly even read, where he makes the case, and I'm summarising it, that everybody should be free up to the point where their freedom interferes with somebody else's freedom. And I think that's a good starting point, as so often is the case with John Stuart Mill, for any debate of this kind. The third question concerns the ability of individual companies and states to protect themselves against cyber attacks. You know, and cyber attacks take place for all sorts of reasons. On some occasions, it's effectively what we used to call industrial espionage. In other words, finding out what the design of a particular product within a particular company is. Sometimes it's used for simply disrupting the good conduct of the state, and on other occasions it can be used by organised crime to find out your data and to access your bank account, or to find out about the habits of your life. And so it's a really difficult issue that we've never had to face in that form before. And the other question that arises from that concerns the integrity or neutrality of the communications data providers. Where do they stand in all this? What are their responsibilities? And how do they, in a sense, conduct their businesses in a way that commands the respect of their customers, that they're protecting their interests? And these are also enormous questions that we have to grapple with. And then there's the question of how do we deal. I'm talking about everything I've said so far could be considered to be a matter of public policy in the UK. But there is the wider question about how do you deal with the global reach of these companies involved and those who use them. You know, those who use Facebook or Twitter, the companies aren't even registered in the UK, so how do you regulate that? And I would just throw out the suggestion, and I know that there are international talks already going on about this, but there do need to be some protocols so that there are certain common international standards, so that there's no advantage in being in one country or another in terms of evading whatever regulation may be appropriate. And finally, how do we have a meaningful debate about this? It is, as a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, although there was a little bit of ridicule in the media about it, we actually held, as a result of the reforms that have been made to the way we operate, we actually held our first public hearing towards the end of last year. And the three heads of the agencies, GCHQ, MI5 and MI6, all appeared in public, all answered questions about it, and that is a welcome development. But I think we need to go further than that, and the heads of the agencies need to go further than that. the head of MI5 has made a statement that the Snowden leaks have damaged our national security, damaged their ability to do the job. Now, for reasons which I can't go into at this stage, I think he's probably right about that. But the difficulty is, how do you communicate that without betraying the capabilities of the agencies to the point where those who wish to do harm to the state would know what their capabilities and their methods are? That is the traditional reason why, ministers will say at the dispatch box, well, we don't discuss the reasons for, we don't discuss security operations, we don't discuss those sorts of issues for that reason. I think we've got to ease up a bit on that. I think we've got to, the heads of agencies and ministers have got to find a better way of communicating what the risks are and what the costs might be if we were to be slightly more open than we are. Accepting always that any state has to have some secrets, otherwise we won't be able to defend people properly. And so I don't offer an answer to that, other than the fact, and I'm not saying anything I haven't said to them privately in the past, that they need to find a way to communicate. If they think, if, as they say, the Snowden leaks have damaged our national security, then they need to find a way to express how that has happened and to what extent it has damaged our national security. Now, that isn't an easy task for them to do. Well, I think it is not beyond their capability to do so. So I'll finish where I started. We do need to have, as Yvette Cooper suggested yesterday, I cite Yvette not for any partisan reasons, but I thought it was a thoughtful speech. We do need to have a national debate, and ministers need to engage in it and lead the debate. But also, I think the heads of agencies have a role to play in that, because I think they do command a certain degree of respect amongst the public. And they carry the sort of authority that, senior military personnel, for example, carry with the public. They might not like what they're tasked to do, but they respect their expertise in doing so. So I see today as an opportunity to start, to add to the start that's already taken place on that debate, and I do hope we can reach a place where there is some kind of national consensus about where the line should be drawn. And I hope the rest of this debate will be able to contribute towards that today.
Thank you. A fascinating place to kick off. If I can come to Julian next and then to David. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have to talk, and I apologise, I'm going to have to leave in a bit. It's not because I don't want to hear David, it's because I have various other places
Lets me say all sorts of things I wouldn't have said otherwise.
You'd have said them anyway, David, we know that. And I think one of the issues that we have in this whole area is that it's an area which Parliament is just not very good at. If you look at the history of discussions about anything technological, you tend to see all sorts of problems, whether it's the Minister looking at the Digital Economy Act who talked about IP addresses, intellectual property addresses, a slip of the tongue but somewhat revealing, or ideas that get floated which simply don't work when it comes to technology. It's an area where the politician's syllogism tends to rule. We must do something, this is something, therefore we must do this. And it's very frustrating how many of those ideas happen. Just to give you one other example on the defamation bill that I was quite involved in, there were suggestions to make it a legal requirement for ISPs to filter out any defamatory comment as it passes through their networks. Now, I'm sure there are some technologists here who are very, very good at that sort of thing, but that's quite a challenge. And yet it is one of the most important things for us to get right. Over the next decade or two, the whole issue about privacy in a digital age is going to be one of the defining questions for us to try to work out, because the amount of data that's available is shooting up, and the ability to process it, big data, all of the techniques around there are changing the questions. There'll be much more wearable information. What do you do when everybody can easily do facial recognition on any image on the fly? That will change what we're doing. And it's, of course, also incredibly big business, £110 billion or so in our economy, growing very, very fast. And I've been concerned about this for a while, which is why I was very pleased to get a grant from the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust to hire somebody. This was before any of this blew up, to work on these issues about privacy in a digital age. And I think there's lots of issues, and almost frustratingly, all the debate, or most of the debate recently, has been only about one of them. So there are cases where data is collected with consent. Private companies, the Facebooks and so forth, who get our data because we agree to give it to them. We're not necessarily as careful as we should be about doing that, but we have fundamentally agreed. The question about what can they do? Who owns that data? Who can control that data? There's a separate section where we don't have consent, but we have a sort of state authorisation. We as a group agree that the police or the intelligence services have a role in collecting our information, even if we don't want them to. Then there's the group where there's neither consent nor authorisation, which is essentially the cybercrime space. And one can argue whether foreign countries trying to hack into things counts in the cybercrime group or the state authorisation group. And I think it depends whether it's your country or somebody else's that's doing it. These are the big issues, and they all matter and they all need quite a lot of attention. But most of the debate has been around the state access of it. And I got involved with this when the government wanted to bring in the Communications Data Bill, which was a re-earth version. I think Labour had 2 versions of it previously, to try to collect much, much more information, to do things like collect weblogs that everybody gets on with. This was something which I spent about a year studying, going through quite carefully, and we produced a unanimous committee report which basically shot it down, which described the Home Office information as misleading, massively disproportionate, and Nick Clegg then vetoed it, and I'm very, very pleased that he did that. But while this was going, while we're having debates which were incredibly vague about the amount of data that's collected in communications data, about 570,000 requests for communications data, authorisations of communications data made in the last year, a huge amount of information, and the Home Office has no idea how many people that applies to, or anything else about the basics. What were the purposes, even roughly? An incredibly evidence-thin area of work. And it's in some ways not surprising, because we have very, very limited oversight. And that applies to all the intelligence area. I was shocked recently on the Home Affairs Select Committee to discover that the Intelligence Services Commissioner... Now, the Intelligence Services Commission has a very important role looking at the entirety of intelligence services. Huge amount of what they do. How large do you think their staff would be? What would seem reasonable? They currently have 1 PA. Now, the Commissioner is a very, very distinguished man. That's quite a lot of work for one person and a PA. And there's been, with the Snowden revelations, which I think were hugely shocking, and even those of us who are working on communications data in the bill were apparently being told all sorts of useful information, did not know anything about this whatsoever. We were very clearly misled, as the chair of the committee, a former Conservative Home Office minister, and described at the time as extremely authoritarian, though I think he's changed somewhat. All of that has gone, and there has been fantastically little debate in this country. If you look in the US, it's been a huge thing. If you look in Germany, it's been a huge thing. Here we've seen The Guardian do some fantastic work, and the response from a lot of Parliament has been to try to silence it, and even to threaten The Guardian with prosecution. We've seen some of this resistance coming from both Conservative and Labour MPs, though there have been people in all 3 parties who have tried to get a speech. We've had one debate, and that was quite hard work to obtain. We're slowly beginning to get some traction, I think, within the general public. And I think, actually, this recent story about Yahoo video images really brings it home to people. Because even the people who say, there's nothing in my emails that would be awkward, some of those still, don't like the idea of somebody watching what they get up to on a webcam. I don't know what they're getting up to. But that's certainly becoming an issue. And we have huge problems with oversight. The ISC simply does not command the public confidence that's needed, and the legislation, which is incredibly outdated and overbroad. And that is something which we have to deal with. I actually wrote about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, a policy called a Digital Bill of Rights, which has a serious list of ideas to try to deal with this. It's going to be discussed at our Lib Dem conference this Sunday. Do come along, 10:45, on all the best Parliament channels near you. And it's very good that some of the comments that Yvette Cooper made actually fit very well with a part of what we're saying there. But we go a lot further on the issue of actual collection and access and the legislation itself, rather than just the issue of oversight. We are beginning to get there, and I do welcome Yvette Cooper's comments. It was a shift from what I see as a very authoritarian approach to a more moderate approach. I do very much welcome that. But we do need to go a lot further, and that's why I'm very pleased that this morning Nick Clegg announced a detailed review to be hosted at RUSI to try to pull all of this together in a form that the next government can actually do something about. What should it look like at the end. Now, I'm not going to sort of give you a complete detail of how the legislation should work. I know it shouldn't have the sort of failings that we have with the Telecommunications Act 1984. Section 94 of that essentially gives complete carte blanche to the Home Secretary to make communications providers do anything that they want. It's not revealed. As far as I can tell, there's no oversight of it, and it is incredibly problematic. I think we need to have a principles-based approach. We need to start off with a set of principles about what is okay, what is not okay. There are various ones. There's the 13 international principles that have been drawn up. The tech companies came up with a set of principles. David Omand, the former director of GCHQ, came up with a very interesting set of principles in 2010, one of which was that covert techniques like this should only ever be used as a last resort. And I agree completely with David on this. But if you're collecting every email as it is sent, it doesn't seem to me that's very much like a last resort. That seems to be very much like a first resort. So I agree with what he's saying. Does it actually make us safe? And we hear a lot of rhetoric about how much we benefit. It's actually quite hard to find evidence for how much we benefit. When we looked at communications data, there were huge claims of lives saved. When we asked for evidence of them, we couldn't find any. It's hard with intelligence stuff. There is, of course, a secrecy element. I don't expect all of that to be published. But it's noticeable that in the US, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board said that they could not find a single instance in which the NSA's mass phone surveillance programme made a concrete difference in the outcome of a terrorism investigation. They went on to say, moreover, we're aware of no instance in which the programme directly contributed to the discovery of a previously unknown terrorist plot or the destruction of a terrorist attack. Giving up some privacy to protect ourselves from terrorist attacks might be worth something, but if there's no evidence it's actually doing that, surely the value has to be a lot less. Whose fault is it? Now, I don't think that GCHQ have broken the law. I think they've tried extremely hard to stick to the law, and I think the problem is actually ours. That we have completely failed to write the right laws for them. We have incredibly broad laws like the Telecommunications Act. And again, I agree with Sir David Omand, very experienced man, former director of GCHQ, who said, democratic legitimacy demands that where new methods of intelligence gathering and use are to be introduced, they should be on a firm legal basis and rest on parliamentary and public understanding of what is involved. That's what we should aim for. We have completely and utterly failed as a parliament to do that, and I hope we'll grasp the nettle and start making a difference now. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. David, if I can come on to...
Sure, okay. This is going to be a little ad-lib for a variety of reasons, but let me start with the sort of nature of the problem. Ray Kurzweil, a few years ago, wrote a book which we, between us, think was The Age of the Spiritual Machines, when I took a collective view for the panel, in which he pointed out that the geometric growth or the exponential growth of the effectiveness of technology gets to a point at some point where it's qualitatively different, where the quantitative changes become qualitative changes. And at that point, all sorts of things happen. Your rules of thumb fall to pieces. Your understanding falls to pieces. The way you make decisions become much more difficult. And I think we've passed, or just about passing that point of inflection now. And the evidence for that is that this isn't just the only area where data-based issues are controversial in politics. I mean, it's your expertise, so you'll know, but as we have the arguments about surveillance this week and the last week or two, we're also having an argument in parallel about the National Health Service collection of data, an equally controversial issue, and demonstrating that actually this is going to come up time and time again. And one of the problems we have is that with some very few exceptions, the politicians are not technologists. They view technology as very little removed from magic in terms of providing solutions. They don't understand the downsides. They will accept phrases like big data and think this is a sort of magical set of techniques, when in fact it's just a portmanteau term for a variety of things. And as a result, they are very gullible. Now, politicians are not normally viewed as gullible, but in this context, they are hugely gullible. And if you want to understand that, look back at some of the debates in the last 2 years on these issues. There have been some incredibly gullible things said by people masquerading sometimes as experts. What is more, the approach to things is also naive. And let me give you one naive example. It's an issue that will come up time and again, and that is that more is better. If you're collecting data, it's always the case that more is better. And that will be the standard line put to the joint committee that Julian sat on by the agencies, that we need more. We need to meet a gap. And they were representing a gap in coverage as equivalent to a gap in telephone hacking or telephone intercept, when in fact they're talking about a gap in coverage of virtually the entire living conversation of everybody under 30. So the more is better was one example of many naive approaches, and we see it in the sorts of things they do. I mean, I have to say, I wonder, after the Yahoo chat photographic intercept operation, what it does to improve national security for the British state to be the biggest holder of internet pornography in the world, which is pretty much where we've arrived. I do not understand what they think they're achieving by a mass collection program there. Now, in terms of the issue, it's suddenly becoming topical after a year or more in which many people, Julian included, have fought very hard to make this a front-page, front-bench issue, and which the front benches have been notably silent, both sides on it. Within 2 days, we have the Deputy Prime Minister and the Shadow Home Secretary commenting on the issue in very, very similar terms. And I have to say, thoughtful, intelligent, insightful speeches on both sides, both of them breaking the mould, in the case of Yvette, that she had pursued for some time. In the case of Nick Clegg, I assume the mould he was forced to hold as Deputy Prime Minister, because he had to hold the government line on these things. Both of them going well outside what their previous position was. So something's happening. They understand whether it's the level of understanding is increasing, whether it's the level of public appreciation is increasing. But to look at the case, it's worthwhile comparing the situation here with the situation in the United States, where there is massively more information. I mean, to pick up your point on the issue of how open we can be, I do not think that the United States, with a fantastically more open approach to this, has run into any more security issues than we have. And what does that allow us to do? It allows us, well, you just heard some quotes from Julian on the President's privacy
Civil Liberties Oversight Board.
Civil Liberties Oversight Board. They were commenting on the fact that a major metadata collection program had not delivered any successes. At the beginning of the process, about 6 months ago or a bit longer, the agencies in the States were claiming 54 active terrorist cases having been stopped. Their oversight procedure and their judicial committee, their judiciary oversight committee, were able to actually investigate those cases. And they dissolved and dissolved and dissolved till they came down to one case in which one man in San Diego had sent $8,500 to Somalia. That was the sum total of a multi-billion-dollar program investigating virtually everybody's metadata. What is more, one of the results of that openness has meant that they've already, without outside pressure, the American agencies have already cancelled the internet, the email metadata program 2 years ago, I think it was, 2 years ago, because it was not cost effective. It didn't work. And so I want to put a sort of completely contrary view to the convention on this to you, and it's this: that actually gathering more data is a positive impediment to good intelligence and national security. And let me give you 2 examples. 9/11, we knew at least some of the plotters, or at least the agencies knew some of the plotters. They had data on them, they had intercept data on them, they even knew where effectively Al-Qaeda's international exchange was, in Sana. And they were able to intercept that. And yet they did nothing with the information. They didn't use it, and 9/11 happened, with all the tragedies that followed from that. We had something quite similar in Britain. The 7/7 bombing, the individuals concerned were on the MI5 database. There were recordings of them talking about plots against people's lives, and yet again nothing was done. Why? In each case, I suspect, at least in part, because they had so many targets, so much information, they couldn't process and act on it all. So not only is more not necessarily better, more can be positively worse. So in technical terms. Now, in terms of where we go from here, firstly, I pick up the points already made by George and Julian. Much more openness is necessary. Much more openness is necessary. And frankly, much more truthfulness is necessary. It was plain as a pikestaff watching them that the agencies attempted to mislead the Joint Committee. Now, this is quite something. A government agency setting out to give the wrong impression to a committee set up by both Houses of Parliament in order to decide what laws should govern what they do. I cannot think of any worse action by a government employee, and yet that happened. And that's pretty much what David McLean, Lord Blencathra, who was the head of that committee, said in terms. And Julian's right, he's an old friend of mine. He makes me look like Karl Marx. But nevertheless, he looked at this and he absolutely was appalled by the propaganda, frankly, that was being handed over. And that propaganda is only possible because of what I mentioned earlier, which is that Whitehall is incredibly technically incompetent. It does not understand the technology it's dealing with. It does not know the power or indeed the danger of it. And again, Julian referred to a few of the points, the effects of face recognition capabilities going to have on the power of these search routines, the ability to process the metadata. We have a Home Secretary who describes metadata as just like your phone bill. Just like your phone bill. I mean, I had to put my own metadata in the public domain to show that it tracked everywhere I went and everywhere I called and who I talked to and who I was standing next to. And what's our Home Secretary doing? Saying that. And she's in my party. What's she doing is saying that, when in fact, of course, is a complete travesty of what the actual truth is. So it's a very serious area. It's going to be hugely controversial in the next year in this House. But I do think the outcome will be, with the aid of people like George, good people on the ISC, who are going to actually take a grip of this, I think, and make it much more open than it's ever been. And as a result, make it slightly better understood and much more effective.
Thank you. On that inspirational message of parliamentary incompetence, if we could come to Jari, then to Kathy, then to Ian, then to Nick. Jari.
All right. So first, I want to thank you all for organizing this and coming here. It's a really important opportunity to discuss, and this is not a topic that any single party should discuss. It's really the technical communities, the businesses, the citizens, the legislators, different parts of the societies need to talk about it to find the balances that we talked about earlier. And the balance is not just between liberty and crime prevention, but it's also, if you think about the internet as a global system, how do we balance this, the effects of this issue or actions thereof on that global system. So it's really, really important that we have these discussions, not just here, but also going forward in many other places. So I wanted to talk about the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is, of course, the standardization organization for core internet technologies, starting from TCP/IP, DNS, HTTP, email, instant messaging, all kinds of things like that. The surveillance has been a big topic for us, probably the biggest topic in the last 6 months, even though we deal with many, many other issues as well. We have multiple working groups working on this topic. We just held a workshop with another standards organization, the W3C, here in London a couple of days ago. So it's not just the IETF, it's multiple standardization organizations working on this. And our discussion at the IETF has focused on large-scale, all-inclusive gathering of information from internet communications, which we call pervasive monitoring. And we, of course, care deeply about the internet services that we all need for various purposes and their trustworthiness. So it's we have taken the reports about pervasive monitoring as a troubling sign. But at the same time, the IETF is not a political forum. We have no political opinions. We are only focusing on the technology. And so we don't really have an opinion whether surveillance, for instance, is good or bad as such. And of course, many aspects of this topic extend beyond the IETF's technical scope. But we do have to understand, as a technical organization working on some part of the technology, we do have to understand what the dangers facing that technology and its users are. And we have a responsibility that we need to develop that technology going forward. How should we evolve it to respond to all kinds of issues, including the danger of pervasive monitoring. So as we have been talking about this, has been a very clear opinion in the IETF community that this is a problem. This is a security vulnerability from the point of view of the users, and something that we actually want to address, or we, in some cases prevent, in some other cases mitigate to some extent. And this is because, of course, the IETF is about improving the internet technology, including the security aspects. This is one particular security issue, and of course, just like for all the other security issues, we have to deal with that. But it's not just that. It is also a security problem that is difficult to know what's happening behind. So we don't actually know what the motivation for any kind of monitoring or attacks on internet traffic is. Consider thieves stealing password data or credit card data. And the security vulnerabilities, they tend to be democratic in the sense that if they're today available for the intelligence agencies, maybe tomorrow they are available for the neighboring countries' intelligence agencies, and then the criminal organizations, and then the neighbors' kids. And we really have to stop it at some point. It is not feasible to leave security vulnerabilities in the internet protocol system. Otherwise, we will be in trouble. And I actually wanted to go back to history a little bit because we're not here for the first time in this kind of discussion. So in the 1990s, we had a big discussion in the world and also at the IETF about the use of encryption, whether we should be using encryption to begin with, and if we are using it, should we be using strong or weak techniques. And there were many parties, mostly governments, were pushing for some of these weaker techniques, and the point of that was that, okay, then it's better, or it's easier monitored for criminal activities. At the time, we actually, after a lengthy debate, decided to go for the strong mechanisms. And I think that was actually a good decision because today, everything that we do on e-commerce and things like that are actually based on those strong security technologies. And without that, maybe it would not be as widespread and useful as it is today. So we are trying to do things, and of course, it's important to understand again that technologists are just one group here, and technology alone is not the full answer to any of these concerns or the finding the balances. And even if we find perfect technical solutions for things like communication security, it still leaves a lot of room for both worries about what's on the other side. Can I trust the other party in the communication, or room for instance, legal interception activities on the other side. So it's not just about technology, but we try to do our part. And there are some things that we can do, and we're doing that. We've had lots of discussion about it during the last 6 months, and have started a number of different activities. Created a few working groups, or at least one new working group, and a number of different activities. Some examples of these activities: replacing bad cryptographic algorithms with good ones. RC4 is one that we're trying to phase out. We're making new recommendations about techniques that already exist but should be used more widely. Perfect forward secrecy, or PFS, is one example of that should be more widely used in TLS. We're updating key internet protocols like TLS and HTTP to their new versions to allow them to be better secured and deployed. And last but not least, these are activities in the internet standardization or the technical community. But if you look at the internet community more broader, then they have actually been quite active in the last couple of years for various reasons. one being the surveillance discussions, but also other security worries in securing the internet traffic more. As an example, using HTTPS more than unsecured web traffic, and so the growth of this secure traffic is very visible, and so it is happening.
Thank you. Thank you, Jari. Very practical stuff. Kathy.
Thank you for having me as well. I'd like to pick up here where Jari leaves off. He's talking about technical vulnerabilities of the internet, which is a network of networks. It's a global network of networks, 30 billion users. This network has delivered, we know, enormous economic benefits, social benefits to users, to communities, to governments across the world. We also now know that it's been used for what we're calling pervasive monitoring, unknown by those users, unimagined by most of them. And that has resulted in a lack of trust, a diminishing of the trust that the users have in this technology. That is a problem. It not only affects the individual rights of users who had expectations of certain levels of privacy, but also in the use of the technology by the very businesses and communities that are producing benefits for the community. This trust has to be restored to communities, but in the internet itself. The legitimacy of the trade-offs that you all talk about, of this security and privacy, the legitimacy of the balance that's struck, absolutely depends on the agreement of the people. It absolutely depends on the agreement and participation of those who use the technology. And without that, there is a violation of trust, and there is a pulling back from the use of a technology that can do so much good for so many. At the Internet Society, we believe very deeply that stakeholders, all stakeholders to the internet, in the internet community, need to have a voice, need to be able to participate and contribute to the development and the implementation of internationally recognized data ethics practices. We need that grounding so that both users and governments, as they debate and decide how they protect their citizens, how they use their citizens' data, what they do with that data, how they store that data, how long they store that data, has the informed participation and consent, I would say, of the users of the internet itself. The power of the government to decide these things must indeed rest on its people. We believe in a multi-stakeholder approach to something that's called very generally internet governance. That is, governing this amazing network of networks. That means we have to have processes by which those people, those communities, those entities that have a stake in the trust that we need have to be brought to the table. And I think I'm very happy to be here in a legislative body to say that at least in democratically elected countries, that there is an opportunity, if given, for that outreach, for the participation of people who have technical expertise, who actually understand the data, who actually understand the effects of what it is we're talking about, to bring it to the table so that decision-making is based upon facts, principles, and knowledge. It's interesting to me to think of an example where at least the users of the internet perceived that the governments of the world were operating without their knowledge, in secret rooms, they said, whether that be true or not. It was perceived as such. What happened then? And I'd like to just point to the ACTA treaty that I think most of us are aware of. there was a perception by the users of the internet that the agreements that were making government to government did not bring into, that they were not brought into the room to understand what was going on, to understand why it was going on, to understand how they would be affected. And interestingly, in this internet age, the users can speak. That is the nature of the internet. The users can speak. And when they did, they said to their governments, you really cannot act without our participation. I think it's a lesson for us as we debate and as we talk about this very serious question, and in no way I'm suggesting it's not a serious question, as to how we secure our people from terrorists, from criminals, from harm. How we achieve that security, we need the participation of the people, of the users, and that conversation has to be a real one. So as we move forward, I think more education is required about how the technology works. One, what happens when you have the kinds of technology deployed for the kinds of pervasive collection of data. We're talking all of the data. I don't even think we can imagine the amount of data that we're describing here that was being collected, stored, and analyzed on every user. There requires a moment of thought about this. And I think data about its effectiveness and data about the harm that it could cause, both the trust of the users and also the ability of individuals to ever have a say about what's happening to them, known or unknown. That right of redress to their government, that right of the ability to have a look at it and say, how should this actually work? So as we move forward, ISOC, the Internet Society, says, let's bring the users to the table.
Thank you. We'll come to Ian, then to Nick, and then on our ever-expanding panel to Wendy, and then we will come out to the floor for questions. Yes.
And I will be brief. So you often hear in debates in the UK, in the US and elsewhere, discussions about how we find a balance between privacy and security. There's the idea that there's a magic dial which in some countries, in some circumstances, you might want to, turn the dial one way. What I want to just briefly point out is I want to distinguish three different situations in which to think about that. It's almost a truism in a lot of political debate. Actually, I think often it's very misleading as an idea. So first of all, my first case is where actually privacy and security are not in conflict at all. There are all kinds of security mechanisms, both in the physical world and in the online world, where improving the security of a system in no way actually impacts on privacy. So if anyone follows Bruce Schneier, I'm sure some of you do, a very well-known security technologist that writes a lot about these issues online. As he said, there's plenty of examples of security that don't infringe on privacy. So in the real world, door locks and fences. Online, things like firewalls. When you're thinking about securing networks, securing systems, making them more resilient, able to hold off attacks and to stay up when there are attacks, very often the kind of technology you're talking about is not at all going to have an impact on the privacy of users. And Jari mentioned encryption. That's a great case study. He talked a tiny bit about the technology and the standard side of that. Let me just mention as well, on the political side, that was something that the US government throughout the late 70s, 80s, and most of the 90s was very concerned the spread of encryption would make it much more difficult for law enforcement and intelligence agencies to investigate serious crime, counter-terrorism, and so on. Actually, what became clear during the 90s as the internet really took off and became a mass medium was encryption was absolutely essential if users were going to have trust in the network, were going to be willing to do things like send sensitive information like credit card numbers online. And of course, it's in every browser. I'm sure most of you are using it to a greater or lesser extent every day. That was something governments themselves through bodies like the OECD, recognised in the mid-90s, and eventually, 2001 actually, the US government gave up trying to use export controls to stop the spread of encryption technology. So I think those are good examples of where privacy and security are not at all in conflict. My second case would be where, for very good security reasons, such as counterterrorism, trying to investigate serious crime, I certainly don't think, George, that many people would agree with the people you were talking to that said social media should be a safe space for criminals, if you like. I think most people would recognise there are all sorts of harms that can happen to people online, and of course the police and investigators. I know you weren't. I know you weren't saying that. So targeted, proportionate use of surveillance powers to combat serious crime. I think the important thing there, and I absolutely agree, it's good that this debate is now getting going in the UK, with the Shadow Home Secretary yesterday, the Deputy Prime Minister this morning, saying some important things to think about then are things like transparency. So a number of internet technology companies, I think it's very positive, like Google, Microsoft and Yahoo, publish statistics on the number of law enforcement requests they receive each year, and since the Snowden revelations, the US government has allowed them to include in those statistics national security requests for data. Nick Clegg is talking about the UK government, if he was able to persuade his partners, doing that right across the board. I think that would be very positive. I think the limitations at the same time are important. You often hear people, particularly on the intelligence side, for understandable reasons, saying we need to retain the ability to do very large-scale collection of data or access of data, but there's no intrusion until a human analyst actually goes into the database and looks at that data. I think that's really completely the wrong way round of looking at the problem. I think as soon as the state does collect data, you start to get intrusion. Of course, it's not as great as an analyst listening into a conversation or reading an email. And actually, I think President Obama's NSA review panel was absolutely right on this when they said, let me just give you a small quote from them, although we might be safer if the government had ready access to a massive storehouse of information about every detail of our lives, the impact of such a program on the quality of life and on individual freedom would simply be too great. And this is especially true in light of the alternative measures available to the government. We recommend that the USG should examine the feasibility of creating software that would allow the NSA more easily to conduct targeted information acquisition rather than bulk data collection. I think that's a really critical point to say. You limit the data collection, not just the use that the intelligence agencies make of the data once you get it. And my third and final category is where I would say actually an absolutely critical part of security, of national security, is of protecting privacy and other human rights that underpin democracy. A lot of other European countries, notably Germany, they have intelligence agencies which are called things like Office for the Protection of the Constitution. That is seen as one of the most important components of their national security. And there is always a risk with very intrusive surveillance powers that they become abused. Actually, as the European Court of Human Rights said in Leander versus Sweden, there's a risk that a system of secret surveillance for the protection of national security poses of undermining or even destroying democracy on the grounds of defending it. These are not imaginary risks, not even in the democracies. We're not only talking about authoritarian countries here. In the US, you just have to look at J. Edgar Hoover and the use that he put the FBI's then very primitive surveillance powers compared to today in terms of doing things like spying on Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the States, in fact, to the level where the FBI was using information they had got about Martin Luther King and the fact that he was having an affair to try to blackmail him into killing himself. It's quite extraordinary. A second example that the NSA review panel reminded us of, that during the Vietnam War, the FBI, quote, engaged in extensive infiltration and electronic surveillance of individuals and organizations opposed to the war. The CIA monitored a broad array of anti-war organizations and activities, accumulating information on more than 300,000 people. I mean, this was pre all of this technology we're talking about today. The Army intelligence initiated its own domestic spying operation, gathering information on more than 100,000 opponents of the Vietnam War, including members of Congress, civil rights leaders and journalists. the government sought not only to investigate its critics on a massive scale, but also to expose, disrupt, and neutralize their efforts to affect public opinion. So these are dangers to democracy that democracies have to be very careful about, indeed, in passing laws that give sweeping powers on the basis that we must trust the intelligence agencies to do the right thing, particularly in requiring internet service providers and other kinds of internet technology companies to change their systems to enable very large-scale data access, even if usually today we might trust the government of the day to use it. Well, what about the government of 10 or 15 or 20 years' time? The key piece of legislation here dates back to 2000. It was being debated since the mid-90s. So, this is how long legislative frameworks last. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick, penultimately.
It's difficult to know what to say when so many excellent points have been made by colleagues. I think I'll start with my first reaction from this morning, and I saw the Press Association copy on the Deputy Prime Minister's speech. And as the copy rolled down, they said that the Deputy Prime Minister was very keen to have a debate about big date, D-A-T-E. I'm not quite sure if this is a new niche dating website or large fruit. But the fact that was the second paragraph in a lead article about the Deputy Prime Minister did ring an alarm bell that perhaps we still have an understanding issue about these concepts. And that was something I think reaffirmed by the reaction of Mark Zuckerberg. When these revelations first broke, the President of the United States stood up and said, and the American public do not need to worry. The American government is not spying on them. And it took somebody who was the CEO of a company where 80% of their customers were foreigners to point out that for an American business with customers around the world, drawing a distinction between spying on Americans and foreigners was not particularly helpful to attracting customers who were not Americans. Now, again, this is a critical economic issue, and the President stumbled into making what seemed like a reasonable point and was actually extremely damaging to the US economy. And in a few months, Bloomberg estimated the damage was $35 billion over a simple comment which he thought would reassure his own citizens. And so I think this is my central point. And if there's one thing we can solve tonight, I think George is absolutely right. Trying to create a list of solutions is very difficult. But what strikes me is that we are still working in a situation, those of you who have ever read the Howden reports and commissions about how government is structured, we essentially have a structure of Whitehall, whether it's intelligence agencies or, say, the NHS, which date back in concept terms, if not real terms, until the 1910, 1920 pre-war period, where we have this situation where we have an agency that does foreign signals intelligence, an agency that does domestic intelligence, a different agency that does domestic law enforcement, and we drew these silos that determine how this works. And even as recently as 2000, as Ian mentioned, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act draws a line in the sand between internal communications and external communications. But that distinction isn't drawn on the people who are on the end of the line. It's drawn on where the information flows. And that's quite literally based on an era when we might feasibly have tapped every phone call to the Yemen or the Soviet bloc. And we would never dream of tapping every phone call within Britain, and that would require a Secretary of State's warrant. That framework is broadly still the same framework we have for fibre optic cables, carrying internet traffic around the world. And I read a statistic the other day which shows that right now roughly 25% of the world's internet traffic will at some point traverse the UK on a daily basis, with the remaining 75% probably hitting the United States in some way. So this internal-external definition, which is an arcane construct, is still being used nowadays. And I think if there's one challenge from a technological perspective, it's to come up with a legal definition that reflects more accurately how information flows, while at the same time not creating a situation where intelligence agencies can't do their job, because to spy on anybody, they either have to go to the country that they're in or to have a named warrant. So I think the technology and the law do fit together. But there's also, as Ian said, a policy question. It's not a legal question if you want strong encryption or weak encryption. That's not the kind of thing that Parliament would vote on in many ways. That's a policy decision. And how do you ensure that the policy decisions fit with the aspirations of the tech community and the political community without it ever being something that would be voted on the floor of the House, because it might be taken as a given that encryption is a good thing. But how do you manage the details around the edges of which random number generator is used or pushed, or which company is a partner? So those questions are policy questions, not legal questions. And then I think we do need to come back to this fundamental point, which is the values we have as a society. Now, if someone told me that, don't worry, we're going to put a CCTV camera in every bedroom, but it's not surveillance, because we have very, very strict rules about when people are allowed to look at the tapes, we might say that doesn't hold true. There's still a camera there, it's still recording information, the process of looking at the tapes is irrelevant. But that is the argument and the construct that we're asked to accept for the bulk collection of internet data. Don't worry, it's not surveillance, we have good rules to govern when someone can look at it. And so the values we have as a society should not fall apart just because the technology changes. And so I think if there's one thing we can kind of work on and take forward from tonight, it is that technology still holds true the values that we have as a society in the real world, and we don't have different values online and offline. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Fine.
I'll try and be brief, thank you. That was really good, actually. Very, very good comments there. I'm Professor Wendy Hill from the University of Southampton, and I'm a victim of security tonight, because there was a queue about an hour long to get in tonight. I don't know what's happening, but I wondered if I was going to be flying somewhere, because it feels like Heathrow, doesn't it, now, coming in. But on my world, I'm a scientist and an engineer. I build things and I was involved in building hypermedia type systems before the web, and I've been working with Tim since before the web, Tim Berners-Lee, since before the web existed. And we being Tim and I and others, back in about 10 years ago, started looking at the web as a social technical ecosystem that we can study, because the web, that sits on top of the internet, and there's one can study the internet similarly, is the web is a social contract. It only works because we put things on it. All right? If we society chose not to use it, it would stop working. That would be the end of it. And so everything, all the infrastructure that we've built on it, for business, for governing, for anything, just stops. So it is absolutely already a social contract. And, I think you've all made some wonderful points about this. And the other thing to say is incredibly complicated. I often draw analogies with what we're trying to do with understanding that. I talk about the web and what's happening is creating a digital planet. And we're only 25 years into it, we're celebrating this year the 25th anniversary of Tim writing his document describing what the web was going to be. It's only 25 years. That's nothing. And I talk about the digital planet that we are creating using this. We try and understand the physical planet. And we have a hell of a problem doing that. And we have teams of scientists gathering data all over the world about what is happening on, how much rain is falling, how much wind is blowing, how much the seas are rising. All this information, huge amounts of information that we use the internet to collect, and we use computers to analyse, and we know something's happening, but we can't work out how much is created by us as a society and what we need to do about it, and we can't even agree on that as a global society. We haven't even begun to get traction on that. And this is much more complicated and much less understood and much newer. So it's all about baby steps, I think, and we aren't going to solve it overnight. But for sure, the web and the internet run on, as I say, it's social contract, and it's about openness. And I mean open in terms of it works because you put something on the web, whether you're a person or an organisation or a government, because potentially the whole world's going to read it. And if you close that down, what would be the point in writing a Wikipedia entry if only 10 people could read it? You wouldn't bother. Right? You just wouldn't bother. And this is the social contract that I think a lot of people don't understand. So it's the openness of it and the level playing field of it, which people like Vince Cerf and Bob Carr and Tim Berners-Lee got so much, that makes the whole thing work. So clamping down on it, I use the analogy of, we don't make our streets secure by creating a curfew. Right? We have learned over many centuries about how to create a safe, civilised society most of the time. Of course there's crime, there's horrible things happen, but generally speaking, I'm going to go outside that door, walk down that street, and I'll probably be okay. And that's what we... But yes, exactly. But this internet thing, we don't understand how to do that yet, and we're having to do that very, very quickly. And if we think we're going to make laws next year that's going to sort that out, it's not going to happen. There's a huge amount of education, and it's not just educating kids or adults or the senior citizens or politicians about data, and it's actually it's all of us understanding this thing that we are building. It's us that's building it. It is created by us, and that's what I think is really important. So I'm going to finish by saying two things. One is the relationship between governments and citizens is hugely important in this. We need transparency. We need people, to be told what's happening, not the detail of it, but we need an understanding and a contract there. And we have the issue of the Data Protection Act in this country, where it seems that we law-abiding citizens have to obey the Data Protection Act, but our governments can break it whenever they like and store our data for as long as they want. And the relationship between governments and the big internet companies is really important. And I do a lot of work in China, and I don't know if anyone's mentioned China tonight. Whole different ballgame there. Now, mostly we just ignore it because we don't understand, because we can't speak Chinese. But they, of course, have a different way of handling it, and they have people, that you can't be a web-based company in China without agreeing to having people monitor what people are saying on your social network. But they still allow the social networks to happen. But recently they changed the law because there was a lot of activity on their version of Twitter talking anti-government. So they brought in a law that said if you put a lie on Twitter, on their equivalent, Weibo, you go to jail. And that killed it, right? Now, the thing is that the consequence of that could be a bounce back in another way, and they don't know that yet. And we don't know what happens when these types of decisions are made, because things will bubble up elsewhere, because China for sure wants to use the internet, the web, for business. It's not going to try and shut it down. In fact, the criminals want us to use it. There's no way they want anything shut down. And governments want to use it for business. So this whole sort of relationship between governments, big companies and citizens is really, really important for us to try and sort out in this world where most people don't understand what's going on. And the dangers of fragmenting the internet are huge. When you get countries like France and Germany saying, and maybe they talk for the EU, I don't know, they're saying, well, we don't like all our traffic going through the US now. It was okay while that was benign, but now we think that they're looking at what we're doing, we're going to create our own internet. Well, we don't know if technically they could do that. But even talking about it is really not the way forward. So my plea is for more research. I would say that, wouldn't I? But we are on a long journey here. We're just at the beginning. And my plea is that what we're trying to do is create what I call a web observatory. This is not surveillance. This is looking at what the impact of decisions is, monitoring day in, day out, like the climate scientists do for the physical planet, but having people all around the world monitoring in a safe, benign way what the masses are doing. So if there's a change in policy, what's the effect of that? If an internet company changes its policy or another network grows, what's the effect of that? What happens to other things? What do we do? What do we not do on the web? How do we behave on the web? And that's where my focus is trying to create a science base that will then inform this sort of decision making. Sorry.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Wendy. That note of the web as a maturing platform, I think, is a brilliant note to close the panel on. George is with us for another few minutes, so if I could go out to the floor for questions, if anyone has anything specifically they would like to grab George for before he leaves, then do stick your hand up. Failing that, any more generalised questions to the panel? Who got there first, madam?
The question is, GHD has been said was not has nothing done against the law. There is a court case, a fast-track court case before the European court in Strasbourg. So if you kind of get a ruling that says it has violated your commitments to European law, convention, how would that feed into your reform or into your deliberations here in the UK?
I think the Intelligence and Security Committee, which I'm a member of, had an initial look at the use of PRISM and whether or not the agencies involved committed any offence by having access to that. And we concluded that we don't think they have done anything wrong at this point in time. But what we do think, and I think David Davis made the point, that the law is confusing. There is European law, the relevant articles of the European Convention on Human Rights and how that applies in our domestic law. There's REPA, there's data protection issues involved, and there's a whole array of different legal potential legal avenues that can be followed. So I think I don't think we're at the stage now. I think probably what we need is at some point recognising the limitations that have just been talked about, some consolidated legislation within which, and I'm a bit premature with this, that's my personal view. I should say that the Intelligence and Security Committee are looking at that, and it's not necessarily their view. But I think it would make sense to do that. And recognising the difficulties involved doesn't necessarily absolve you from the challenges.
No, absolutely.
I'd just like to make one point that I think exemplifies why it's such a challenge. There is there's a website or an online magazine. I don't know if anybody. I don't necessarily recommend that you should read it. Called Inspire. Has anybody ever heard of it? Pardon? It's ACAP, Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. That's where it comes from. Now, Inspire has it can serve. If you're a young, well, you don't have to be a young Muslim. You could be anybody, but it potentially serves three purposes. The first one is that it can provide you with an ideological inspiration or an ideological framework for becoming a Salafist, and if you want to go a bit further than that, for becoming a jihadist. There is a distinction between the two, which is probably not necessary to go into. But so that's the first thing it can do. Now, so that's a hearts and minds issue. I think it's incredibly difficult to say, in a democratic society, to say, so long as they're not saying you should go and do this in that location and this is how you can do it, that's wrong. I mean, it's incredibly important that we argue against it. It's incredibly important that we put the opposite point of view. But the hearts and minds issues in a democracy is a really difficult one, and you get into all sorts of arguments about censoring people's beliefs and so on. And if you're not careful, you get into this whole thing about some of the things the CIA, for example, have done in the past. The second thing it does is, and then you do get into difficulties, it can train you. It can tell you how to make a bomb, how to disrupt critical, and it's accurate, by the way, it's not fanciful. It can tell you how to disrupt the critical national infrastructure, and it can also give you graphic ideas about how to carry out acts of, at the very least, disruption, and at the very other end of the spectrum, killing somebody. Finally, it acts potentially through encrypted links as a means of communication. So the reason I'm sorry to go on at length about that, but I think it kind of exemplifies the point. There are 3 different ranges of activities, 2 of which are unlawful. And by the way, before I finish, if I just give you a word of advice about Inspire. If you're going to look at it, just look at it. If you download it, it's not illegal, but if you happen to be on somebody's radar, questions will be asked about why you're downloading it. If you upload it, you're actually committing an offence. So it's that, and believe me, if you look at it yourself, you'll realise why that range of sanctions needs to be in place.
Practical advice on Inspire.
I'm sure I'm committing an offence.
Yes, exactly. How long have we got you for?
I could take another one if that's all right with the other panellists.
Steve Farrell, colleague of yours, involved in the IETF. Is there a recognition that a lot of the techniques required to do this very broad pervasive monitoring are immediately going to become attack tools for any other purpose whatsoever?
Sorry, can you explain?
So the techniques required for the kind of pervasive monitoring that doesn't involve collaboration or coercion of sites, breaking into sites, becoming a market, paying people to develop zero-day attacks and so on. A lot of what the intelligence agencies required for fully broad pervasive monitoring immediately becomes an attack tool for anybody else, because when you make this attack tool over the internet, it's visible to the rest of the internet.
I think I've been trying myself for many months now to think of a way of explaining this that is understandable, not just to everybody else, but to me. And I think it's helpful to look at it in this way. And I agree, we toss this word metadata about as though it is, it's something you can hold on to when it actually isn't necessarily that at all. But what is a fact is that there's billions of pieces of data out there. Some of it is just data, some of it is communication, all of it is both. And somebody's got access to it, even if it's just the communication service providers. So what do we do about that? And I think a way to look at it is what we need to build is a safe so that all of that data and communications is somewhere in a safe. Let's leave aside for the moment discussing whose safe it is, whether it's a state or whether it's the CSPs or whatever. The question then is, who has access to the lock or the code to get into the safe? And I think that is the area where we're all I don't have the answer to that, but I think that is the area that we're all struggling with. Otherwise, the danger is that anybody can, to some extent, it's already happening. I don't know if anyone's had the chance to read Yvette Cooper's speech in full, but she gives the example, and I'm repeating what she said, so don't accuse me of being prurient, but she gave the example that she did some online shopping for underwear with Marks and Spencer's, as a consequence of which, days afterwards, whenever she went on, whenever she looked at her traffic, there were pictures of semi-naked women all over the place because her data had been passed on to people. So it's already being passed around and on. And, you know, and you can see the connection. You know, somebody who buys certain kinds of underwear online, oh, they might be interested in pictures of women modelling this underwear, and so it goes on. So there are all sorts of things about who has the key or the code to the lock that I think really need to be discussed.
Can I say something there? I think this is an important point, and we're going to evolve, I believe, to a world where we take ownership of our data and our interaction data, and that even with our interaction with government, and the NHS records, taking no side here, are an absolute classic example. Your health record is a classic example of something about you want to know who's got it, who's allowed to look at it, and we've heard recently in all these exposures that the government or the NHS has used our data and sold it to insurance companies, and I mean, I think that's appalling. And I knew it was happening because I got a letter from an insurance company when I was going to something at the hospital, and I thought that can only happen because somebody knows I've got that appointment at the hospital, and that's appalling. And we are one of the big things that W3C is working on, and I look to the IETF here because you probably know about this, is the standards for personal data stores. We're increasingly, and this is very new and very embryonic, but increasingly we will have the ability to store our own data and then develop contracts with government and with the big companies as to how and what they can do with the data. Then we do need trusted third parties to help us look after that and create those contracts.
Could I say one thing? I think there's a fundamental difference between my acceptance of using a website, which I can opt out of them passing my information on, and a decision by a government to just take all the data and, by the way, hold it for much longer than any company in the past ever held it, because they were holding it for billing purposes. Let me finish. It is now the governments that are telling the companies to hold it for a long time, thereby actually making that data vulnerable to attack, not only by the government but by other hackers. So we're into a self-enforcing kind of system here, which again I'll assert we need. I
use the analogy: I wouldn't let the government manage my bank account.
We need.
It's called taxes.
Exactly. Just one more point here. So we're talking about making laws about this, and we're talking about our values. But we really need to talk about bringing the stakeholders in and getting the different points of view before we go forward with this. Because just the statement you just made me think, well, if I had a couple of folks here who could explain to you where that data went, why the person who, by the way, got an ad actually could have said, I don't want that, could have used technology on their browser to say, I don't want it.
I understand that. And in fact, Cooper made that point that she could have done that herself, but she chose, for one reason or other in her busy life, she didn't do it. I'm sorry, I don't want to be misrepresented. I didn't say the state should necessarily hold the same. I said there needs to be somewhere where all that information that exists can be put.
Or it doesn't need to exist. It can go away.
If I can get to the gentleman right in the front of it.
How do you know you've been told everything by GCHQ?
Sorry?
How do you know you've been told everything by GCHQ?
Well, for two reasons. The first is that we asked them. I mean, it's difficult really to explain, but we asked them a lot of questions, and I've been on numerous occasions. I've been to the various places they operate from and seen what they do. Now, I don't. I'm not saying that in itself is necessarily sufficient. The other thing is, and this is an area which we haven't covered tonight, there is a commissioner responsible. He's woefully, as somebody pointed out, woefully ill-equipped to do it. and all they can do, they can't look at every piece of every intercept that's taken place, but they can look at randomly generated proportion of them and follow the audit trail back to where it goes. So have they got all the right authorisations? And that is checked. Now, I can't say hand on heart that they've never ever transgressed, but I've no evidence that they have. Do they tell us everything they know? Unless we ask the right questions, probably not. But I like to think we're getting smarter at asking the right questions than perhaps we might have been in the past. But you can never, in the end, you've got to have checks and balances, and I think the most important one is the Intercept Commissioner themselves, that they have the resources to be able to do a proper audit of what is going on, and secondly, that they become more public facing. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, the standard response, and I was unhappy about it at the time in the ISC, is that we don't give a running commentary on the work that we do. The very fact that I'm here tonight, I think, is an indication of the fact that we're very conscious of the fact that we need to be more outward facing. And to be fair to Malcolm Rifkin, who takes a fair amount of stick in the media, he's instituted that change in the way we behave. I think the commissioners need to start doing that. Similarly with the heads of the agencies, until Stella Rimington, nobody even knew what the name was. So, it's evolving, and it's evolving in the right direction.
I mean, it's interesting that the answer to your question is because there's a statutory obligation for them to do so. But at the same time, it speaks volumes that no one actually trusts anymore that they adhere to that statutory obligation.
Because finding the right question, as we know, the difference between surveillance and collection, you don't ask the right question.
Indeed, and arguably the fact that no one trusts is self-inflicted rather than anything else.
I think it's fair to say nobody trusts them.
No, but there is a...
Well, they're collected child porn now.
There are people who do, and there are...
Very few in this room, I suspect.
The gentleman had your hand up.
Hi, my name is Sam De Silva. I'm a partner in a law firm. I'm also the chair of the Law Society's IT and Law Committee. I was asked to give the sort of lawyers or law society's perspective on this. I think one issue which hasn't really been talked about is that one of the fundamentals of the English legal system is that communications between clients or potential clients and lawyers should be privileged. And I think the Law Society has been talking about RIPA for over a decade, saying that it doesn't cover privileged communications. There's no carve-out to it. So it fundamentally sort of undermines that whole sort of privileged relationship between a solicitor and a lawyer, and also the mass surveillance also undermines that as well. We've also been saying for years, I think, RIPA is not fit for purpose. It's too confusing. I mean, if lawyers say that, I think, please take heed of that. It really is quite confusing, so it needs a complete rewrite. And related to that, I think, unfortunately, most pieces of the legislation haven't kept up with technological development. We talk about Data Protection Act, Digital Economy Act, and as the previous speaker talked about, the Communications Data Bill. I mean, that is a prime example of how it all turned horribly wrong. There's a big disconnect between policy objectives, technical objectives, and legal objectives. So I think all those three work streams need to come together and work together to get a piece of legislation or pieces of legislation that actually work.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. If we are to believe David Davis and Julian Huppert, now that the parliamentarians have left the panel, the average level of expertise has risen exponentially. Without risking to agree or disagree with them, we are supposed to be winding up at 6:45, which is essentially now. But I think we can probably take a couple more questions to the panel that remains. Gentleman at the back, and then you, sir, on the left, finally.
My name's Nigel Morgan. I haven't got much to say on this, but...
Please go on.
Really, though, if it's big data, it's going to affect climate change. At the end of the day, okay, we're all going to drown in the data.
What?
Is big data going to affect our understanding of climate change, is presumably the question. Does anyone on the panel have any thoughts?
No, I understand the question, absolutely. That as you gather more and more data, you're using more and more energy to do it. I mean, there are computer scientists like John Crowcroft at Cambridge University that are looking to see how you can significantly reduce the energy impact of that. So,
and it's also, you can't find a needle in a bigger haystack.
there's that specific issue, yes.
Thank you. And just, I'm sorry, we've only got time for one more, Seb, in the striped shirt, yes.
I've been involved in advising business about the internet for quite a few years now. And it's been touched upon, I think, by a couple of your speakers. The economics of the potential for data loss and data security and the whole subject. I believe that we're very close to being controlled from an external source, probably a malign external sources, to destroy our economy through this means. And I want to know what the panel's view is of the likelihood of this, if there's any opinion on this. I think it's the elephant in the room, because you think about our recent experiences in our economy, how that was created, potentially or arguably, was to do with data movement. What are we doing about it now? And it's really unfortunate to see the politicians leaving.
Yes, I don't disagree with you, but we are certainly in the case of George. We are lucky that the ISC is putting itself more out there, and we are lucky that he stayed for as long as he did. So, in the defence of an organisation that I don't work for, who has any observations on the? I don't want to call it conspiracy. Yeah.
What was the question?
Is it
Jared Larrinaga makes the point. I think he's absolutely right that you get to a situation where you have a new oligarchy, and as generally, if you look at the current events in Eastern Europe right now, oligarchs do not always have positive effects. And if you do get to a situation where you have Google, Facebook, and one or two other companies controlling not only our information but our access to information, then suddenly their shareholders have us all over a barrel. Because for all it, they have great branding and great kind of PR campaigns, given the choice between doing something good for citizens and doing what their shareholders want, well, their executive officers are under a legal duty to maximise return for their shareholders. So we shouldn't be surprised if these companies don't always act in our own interests.
Observation. Brilliant. Thank you very much for all that. Christian will now be able to give us details of where the reception is later on, so we can continue this conversation over a drink. Which is a pleasure for all of us. If I could invite you, before Christian says something, to thank our panel, some of them in their absence, but certainly we are very lucky to have been joined by the remaining people here. So if I could ask you to put your hands together again.